Hey everybody, this is Matt here again with another chess video. This is a game played by me as the black pieces on Chess Live. My opponent was xiangqi42 with a rating of 1449 against myself at the time with a rating of 1410. The game started out with pawn to c4, which is the English opening. I opted to play with the symmetrical variation that followed up with pawn to c5. And play from here continues with knight to f3, knight to f6, knight to c3, knight to c6, pawn to e3, and knight to f6. And now we see knight to f3 and pawn to f6, getting ready for black to fink out of the dark squared bishop. One variation you could see from here is white fink outting their light squared bishop. We don't see that. Instead, we see the bishop come over to e2, getting ready to castle on the king side. From here, I play my bishop to g7 so that I can castle as well, and now both sides castle. From here, play continues with rook over to b1, getting ready to advance this pawn up to attack this pawn on the c5. I play pawn to a5, just preventing that pawn from reaching the square by adding another defender along with this pawn. And to add more pressure to this square, we see pawn to a3 by white. And now this pawn cannot be stopped from coming to this square. So instead of trying to somehow put more pressure on the square, which is not possible, I'm just going to go ahead and play pawn to e6, getting ready to thrust this pawn up to d5 to contest this c4 pawn that white has currently. From here we see pawn to e4, trying to put more pressure on this square. And now we see the pawn come up to d5, and we see the pawn on c capture, the pawn on e capture back on d, and now we see pawn capture on d5. Probably better than that would have been just advancing this pawn up to maintain a pawn on e4, rather than give up the pawn that is already centered. But we don't see that. Instead, the pawn captures, and now the knight recaptures. Following up that, we see the pair of knights go off and the queen coming towards the center of the board. And now we see the queen come to c2, trying to put more pressure on this pawn for when this pawn advances up. This is going to induce a weakness in the white position because of bishop to f5, skewering the queen and rook. It forces the pawn to come up to d3 to block the skewer, and now this pawn is going to become a focal point for an attack for a few turns following. So first we see the rook come over to d8, putting more pressure. Next we see the bishop come out, applying more pressure to this pawn, getting ready to try to capture it, which is met by playing pawn to b6, just supporting this pawn yet again. Next we see the rook come over to d1, and I get ready to stack my rooks up on the d file to put even more pressure on this pawn. And rather than white do the same, he just plays queen to a4. He does so because currently, even with the rook stacked, I cannot capture this pawn because one of the main attackers is the queen. If the queen were behind the rook, then I could take the pawn, but since the queen is in front, this pawn is not capturable at the moment. So I just go ahead and stack my rooks, just getting ready to unleash an attack on this pawn later in the game. From here we see queen to b5, which comes here with the intention of trying to get this pawn to then weaken this pawn yet again, as well as making my queen have to watch the knight now. From here, I play knight to d4, putting pressure on the queen. This pawn cannot be immediately captured because of the pressure on the bishop. If the knight captures my knight, then when the pawn recaptures, it'll be attacking the bishop. So we see the bishop capture the knight, and after pawn captures the bishop, white makes a blunder. The correct move was to just capture the queen, trade some queens off. but instead takes the pawn. From here, the queen can be trapped, and in the following way. Well, not completely trapped, but you'll see. First, the rook comes over to b7, attacking the queen. The queen only has one place to go, and that's to a6. Now the rook comes over to e7, attacking the bishop. White has to either move the bishop or move the rook to defend the bishop, and we see the bishop come back. But now the rook comes up to d6, and this queen only has one square to go, and that's c4 to trade queens. But to recapture, this bishop's going to have direct sights of this rook, so white loses in an exchange, but it was the best play after that queen recaptured the pawn. So we see the queens trade, and then the bishop gets traded for the rook. And now the pawn gets pushed up to d3. Always try to push your passed pawns if you're able to successfully push them up the board. The rook comes back to d1 from here, trying to get ready to be able to capture this piece. After the bishop captures on b2, rather than try to hold on to this, I wanted to just take out some of white's remaining pawns, as this pawn would be impossible to hold on to after the knight came back, since I cannot put more pressure on this pawn. It was best to just take this pawn while it was still there. And from here, white makes a blunder. The best move is to just capture with the rook, and then trade off a pair of rooks. But we see the bishop capture, and this is a second blunder by white, as this bishop can now be won by force. The rook comes over to d7, and white resigns from this position because the bishop has no way of being maintained. The best attempt to do is just bringing the knight to e1, supporting the bishop. But next comes just the bishop recapturing the pawn, and once there, the rook nor the knight nor the bishop can move because they're all tied down to each other. And so all white can do is move a pawn or move the king. And then once here, let's just say white moved the king closer. It doesn't really matter what white did. Now the bishop can just simply come here and capture the knight. Actually, yeah, capture the knight. There's no way to stop it. Stop from this bishop from falling or this knight from falling. So white resigned after seeing that. So anyway, I thought this was a decent game to go over. It does show the point that trying to take material isn't always the best way to go, like with that queen back whenever the queen captured on this square. It's not always best to try to get material, even if it looks like it's really free, because the position that the queen is in became very bad. So just because material looks free doesn't mean that you should always try to go after it, especially with your queen. If there are, in this case, the rooks, the queen, and both bishops are on the board, and the queen is in black's territory, be careful about getting your queen there, because there's always that chance that your queen can't get back out, or if she can, like in this case, she can't get back out in a good way because you lose your rook. So anyway, thanks for watching, subscribe, and see you next video.